My husband reported me missing to the Greek police on the fourth night of our honeymoon. I was standing in our hotel room when the officer knocked, still in my robe, coffee going cold on the nightstand. What Derek did not know, what he had never once thought to ask in 2 years together, was that the $180 million contract his boss had been chasing for 2 years answered directly to me. I ran the $2.4 billion foundation Grant Hargrove would have done anything to reach. And sitting there in that Santorini hotel room, I made a decision. I was not going to sign it. If you have ever been underestimated by the one person who was supposed to know you best, hit like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. This story is just getting started. My name is Mindy Cole, and I am 32 years old. I did not grow up with money. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Providence, Rhode Island, where the radiator knocked all winter and the hallway always smelled like someone else's dinner. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office. My father left when I was 9 and sent birthday cards until I was 12, then stopped. My grandmother, Doris Colebrook, lived 4 blocks away and walked me to school every morning until I was old enough to walk myself. She was the one who taught me the thing I have carried my entire life. Stay quiet, stay sharp, let them show you who they are. She said it the way other grandmothers said grace before meals, automatic without ceremony, like it was just a fact of the world. I did not fully understand it when I was 7. By the time I was 26, I had built an entire life around it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was a decent student in a school that did not have much to offer, which meant I had to be more than decent on my own. I read everything I could find. I stayed after class. I asked teachers questions they were not expecting. By junior year of high school, I had a 4.0 and 3 teachers writing me recommendation letters without being asked. I applied to 12 colleges. I got into Harvard on a full academic scholarship, and I did not tell anyone for 3 days because I was afraid if I said it out loud, it would disappear. It did not disappear. I studied finance. I was good at it, not in the loud performative way some of my classmates were good at it, the ones who dominated seminar discussions and wore their ambition like a cologne you could smell from across the room. I was good at it quietly. I saw patterns. I understood how money moved, where it pooled, where it dried up, and why. My professors noticed. 2 of them offered me research positions. I took both. I graduated at 22 and took a job at a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Boston, Tremont Capital Advisors. Nothing glamorous. Steady work, reasonable, pay a window seat. I had to wait 3 years to earn. I liked the anonymity of it. I liked being the person in the room who knew more than she let on. When I was 24, my grandmother had a stroke. She survived, but the recovery was slow and expensive, and I moved her into a care facility in Brookline that cost more than I was comfortable spending. She lasted another 14 months. When she died, she left me a small plot of land outside Providence, about 4 acres she had held since the 1970s. I did not know what it was worth. I had a developer assess it on a Tuesday, and by Thursday I had an offer for $212,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I could have paid off my student loans. I could have bought a car that did not require a prayer every January. I could have done 100 sensible, practical things with that money. Instead, I incorporated a nonprofit, named it after her maiden name, and used the full $212,000 as seed capital for what would eventually become the Colebrook Foundation. I was 26 years old. The foundation's focus was education equity scholarship funding, after-school infrastructure, teacher retention programs in underfunded districts across New England. I understood that world. I had lived inside it. I knew exactly where the gaps were because I'd fallen into several of them myself and had to climb out without help. The first 3 years were hard. I ran everything out of a rented office the size of a large closet with 1 part-time assistant and a board of 5 people who believed in the mission more than they believed in the balance sheet. We gave out $60,000 in scholarships the first year. The second year, a tech executive from Cambridge made a matching gift that changed everything. By year 4, we had crossed the $50 million mark in assets under management. I kept my name off the public-facing materials. That was a deliberate decision, and I made it early. I had watched what happened to other foundation leaders who became the face of their organizations, the way donors started giving to the person, rather than the cause, the way the work got tangled up with ego and visibility, and the particular kind of performance that philanthropy sometimes becomes. I did not want that. I also had a more personal reason. When I was 28, I was briefly involved with a man named Christopher, a real estate attorney I met at a fundraiser. We dated for 4 months. In the 5th month, I found out he had asked a mutual acquaintance to look into my background before our 3rd date. He had not found the foundation. It was structured carefully enough that my name did not surface in a basic search, but the fact that he had looked at all was enough. I ended things that weekend. He called twice to explain. I did not answer. After that, I decided that anyone I let close to me would have to want Mindy from Providence, not Mindy from Colebrook. If they could not love the woman who grew up with a knocking radiator and a grandmother who walked her to school, then they did not deserve to know the rest. That was the rule I carried into every room, including the conference room at a financial services summit in Boston 2.5 years ago, where I met Derek Cole. He was presenting a case study on nonprofit sector consulting, specifically how firms like his could add value to large philanthropic organizations. I remember thinking his slides were too busy and his confidence slightly outpaced his evidence. I also remember that when we ended up at the same cocktail table afterward, he asked me what I did, listened to my answer, financial analyst, Tremont Capital, and did not press further. He talked about his work, his team, a hiking trip he had taken in Patagonia. He was funny in a low-key way. He did not try to impress me with money or connections. He seemed, for lack of a better word, uncomplicated. I found that restful. We dated for 18 months. He met my friends. I met his mother, Eleanor, who smiled at me in a way that never quite reached her eyes, but whom I chalked up to protective rather than hostile. Derek was attentive in the beginning, consistent, present, reliable in the small ways that matter. He remembered I took my coffee black. He did not forget plans. He showed up when he said he would. I told myself that was enough. Looking back now, I think I mistook the absence of red flags for the presence of something real. I was so focused on making sure he did not want me for my money that I failed to ask a simpler question: does he want me at all? He proposed on a Tuesday evening in November at the kitchen table with a ring he had clearly put thought into. I said yes. I meant it. We got married the following September at a small venue in Marblehead. 40 guests, white hydrangeas, the ocean visible from the terrace. My colleague and closest friend Sandra stood beside me. Derek's best man was a college roommate named Phil, who told a speech that was 20% too long but genuinely warm. I cried twice. Both times I meant it. I did not know that 8 of those 40 guests had seen Derek's phone go dark for the previous 3 weeks in a pattern I would later learn to recognize. I did not know that Rachel Voss, his colleague, had sent him a message at 11:47 p.m. the night before our wedding that he had read and not answered. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew, standing on that terrace in Marblehead with the Atlantic behind me, was that I had found something quiet and steady in mind. 4 days into our honeymoon in Santorini, a Greek police officer knocked on my hotel room door to confirm I was still alive. That was when I started to understand what I had actually married. Santorini is the kind of place that makes you believe everything is going to be fine. The whitewashed walls, the blue domes, the way the light sits on the water in the late afternoon, like it was placed there by someone who understood exactly what beauty was supposed to feel like. I had saved a photograph of Oya in a folder on my phone for 3 years before I ever stepped foot on the island. Standing on our hotel terrace the first morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over the caldera, I thought, this is it. This is the version of my life I worked toward. I should have known that the things we want most are the ones that teach us hardest. The first 3 days were fine. Not extraordinary. I want to be honest about that now, looking back. There were moments that felt slightly off, in the way a painting hangs 1 degree crooked and you cannot decide if you're imagining it. Derek was present but distracted. He checked his phone more than I expected for a honeymoon. When I mentioned it lightly on the second evening, we were at a rooftop restaurant. Candles on the table, the kind of setting that should have made everything easy. He said work was complicated right now, that there was a major contract pending, that he just needed to stay on top of it for a few more days. I let it go. I had built an organization worth $2.4 billion by knowing when to push and when to wait. I told myself this was waiting. On the 4th day, we had dinner at a restaurant down the cliffside steps from our hotel. Small place, maybe 12 tables. The kind of menu that takes 20 minutes to read because everything sounds worth having. Derek was warm that evening, laughing, attentive, refilling my wine glass before I thought to ask. I remember thinking, there he is. That is the man I married. I relaxed into the meal the way you relax when something you were bracing for does not come. We walked back up the steps around 9:30. The night was warm and smelled of salt and jasmine and the faint smoke from a kitchen somewhere below. Derek said he wanted to stop at the hotel bar for a nightcap, that I should go ahead, that he would be up in 20 minutes. I went ahead. 20 minutes passed, then 40. I changed out of my dress and into something comfortable and sat on the terrace with a book I could not focus on. At 11, I went downstairs. The bar was open-air set into the cliff face with views of the caldera and string lights overhead. I saw Derek before he saw me. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, not alone. The woman beside him was somewhere in her mid-30s, dark-haired, in a red dress that knew exactly what it was doing. They were not touching, but they were leaning toward each other in the particular way that two people lean when they have already decided something. I stood at the entrance for perhaps 4 seconds. Derek looked up. His face moved through 3 expressions in the space of one breath: surprise, then something I can only describe as calculation, then an easy smile that I recognized because I'd seen him use it in meetings when he needed to manage a situation. I turned around and went back to the room. I did not slam the door. I did not throw anything. I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought very clearly and very quietly, the way my grandmother taught me to think when something important was happening. What do I actually know? What do I need to find out? What do I do next? Derek came up 40 minutes later. He said they were just talking. She was a conference attendee from London. They had a mutual contact in finance. It was nothing. His voice was even and reasonable, the way a person's voice is when they have rehearsed the explanation on the elevator ride up. I said I understood. I said I was tired. I turned off the light. He was asleep in 11 minutes. I know because I counted. The next morning I woke at 6:30, put on coffee from the in-room machine and stepped onto the terrace. The caldera was pink and gold in the early light. I sat down and opened the notes application on my phone and I began to write down everything I'd observed in the past 4 days, times behaviors, what was said, what was not said. I am a numbers person. I have always trusted documentation over memory. Memory softens things. Documentation does not. I was on my second cup of coffee when there was a knock at the door. A young man in a hotel uniform. Behind him in the corridor, a Greek police officer in a short-sleeved shirt and a patient expression. The hotel employee spoke first, apologetic, careful with his English. He said there had been a report filed the previous evening with the local police, a report of a missing person. He said my husband had contacted the authorities around 10:15 to report that I had not returned to the room and that he was concerned for my safety. I looked at the officer. The officer looked at me. I was standing in a hotel robe holding a coffee cup with the morning light coming through the terrace doors behind me. I said, I'm fine. I have been here since approximately 10 o'clock last evening. The officer asked if I could confirm my full name and passport number. I retrieved my passport from the bedside drawer. He wrote something down. He thanked me for my time. He said he was glad I was safe. The hotel employee apologized again softly, and they both left. I closed the door. I stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Derek was still in bed. He had not stirred during the knock. Or perhaps he had chosen not to. I walked to the window, looked out at the caldera. The same view I had saved on my phone for 3 years. Here is what I understood in that moment with the clarity that only comes when something strips away every last thing you were hoping was not true. Derek had not filed that report out of genuine concern. He had filed it so that he had an explanation for where he was, a record that showed him as the worried husband, a document that placed him at the front desk making a call while I, the missing wife, had simply been in the room the whole time. He had used the police as an alibi. I set my coffee cup down on the nightstand. I picked up my phone. I opened my contacts and scrolled to the name of my personal legal counsel, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, no relation to the firm who had handled Colebrook's legal affairs for 6 years and who charged enough per hour that I only called her when something mattered. I typed, I need you to start a file. Personal matter. We'll call when I'm back in Boston. She replied in 4 minutes, understood. It's ready when you are. I put my phone in my robe pocket. I finished my coffee. When Derek woke up an hour later and asked how I slept, I told him fine. I asked if he wanted breakfast on the terrace. He said yes. I ordered for both of us. We ate with the caldera spread out below us, beautiful and indifferent, and I watched him eat his eggs and I thought about everything I now needed to do. He smiled at me over his orange juice, relaxed, relieved. I smiled back. Stay quiet. Stay sharp. I had 3 more days in Santorini. I used every one of them. I booked my flight home on the morning of day 5. Derek did not know until I told him at breakfast, same terrace, same caldera view, same orange juice he had been ordering every morning like a man without a single thing on his conscience. I set my phone face down on the table and said calmly that something had come up with work and I needed to get back to Boston early. He frowned, asked what kind of something. I said a funding decision that could not wait, which was true, though not in the way he understood it. He offered to come back with me. I told him there was no reason to cut his trip short on my account, that he should stay and enjoy the last few days. He did not argue very hard. That told me something. I landed at Logan at 6:45 in the morning 2 days earlier than our return tickets said I would. Sandra picked me up at arrivals. She took one look at my face in the passenger seat, handed me a coffee from the cup holder, and did not ask a single question until I was ready. That is the thing about people who actually know you. They understand that some conversations need a runway before they can take off. By the time we reached my building in the South End, I had told her most of it. The bar, the woman in the red dress, the police officer at my door, the smile over orange juice. Sandra is not a dramatic person. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "I need my desk and I need quiet." She nodded, helped me carry my bags upstairs, made a second pot of coffee in my kitchen, and left without being asked. I have known her for 9 years. She has never once made a hard moment about herself. I sat down at my desk at 8:15 in the morning. The apartment was still and cool the way apartments are when they have been empty for a week. I opened my laptop. I had 43 emails requiring attention, 2 board memos, and 1 message flagged urgent from my operations director at Colebrook, a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been with the foundation since year 2, and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. The flagged message was brief. It said Hargrove and Marsh submitted their full proposal yesterday. Board review is scheduled for 3 weeks out. We need your sign-off to proceed to final evaluation. Also, their point of contact on the submission is listed as Derek Cole, VP of Strategy. I assumed you were aware. Let me know how you want to handle. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Derek Cole, VP of Strategy. Hargrove and Marsh. My husband. Submitting a proposal to my foundation. Asking for $180 million from me, without knowing it was me. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside my window, Boston was going about its morning delivery trucks, pigeons the distant sound of the Green Line. Normal, unremarkable Tuesday sounds. Inside my chest, something very quiet and very cold was settling into place the way ice forms, not all at once but layer by layer, molecule by molecule, until the surface will hold the weight of anything you put on it. I typed back to Patricia, "I'm aware. Do not proceed to final evaluation. Hold the file on my desk. I'll review personally." She replied in 2 minutes, "Done." I closed the laptop. I walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter and thought about the last 2.5 years. Every dinner conversation Derek and I had ever had about his work. The complaints about Grant Hargrove's pressure tactics, the way the man ran the firm like a general running a campaign, the constant push for bigger contracts, more prestigious clients. Derek had talked about Colebrook, specifically not knowing, of course, what it meant to me at least twice, that I could now recall. Once, maybe 8 months ago, he had said Hargrove is obsessed with landing a major nonprofit account. Something like Colebrook would make the firm's entire year. Probably the decade. I had said that sounds like a significant contract. He had said massive. Whoever signs off on that is basically untouchable. I had nodded and poured more wine and said nothing. The week after I returned from Boston, I called Eleanor Marsh. We met at her office in Back Bay on a Thursday afternoon. Leather chairs, diplomas on the wall, the particular quality of silence that expensive law offices have, hushed and deliberate, like the building itself understood the weight of what got discussed inside it. Eleanor listened to everything. The Santorini incident, the missing person report, the woman at the bar, the timing of Derek's return 2 days after mine with luggage that did not match what he had packed. She took notes in a small leather notebook without looking up. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "I want to be straightforward with you. What you have described is consistent with infidelity and with conduct that, in the context of a marriage less than 2 weeks old, may be relevant to a fault-based filing, depending on what we can document." She paused. She said, "Do you want to document it?" I said yes. She gave me the name of an investigator, a man named Paul Garrett, who worked out of a nondescript office in Somerville, and who came recommended by 3 of Eleanor's colleagues as thorough, discreet, and fast. I called him that evening. We met the following Monday. I gave him what I had. He said he would need 2 to 3 weeks. He came back in 11 days. While I waited, I went back to work. Not just Tremont, I mean Colebrook. I attended 2 board meetings, reviewed 4 grant applications, and spent a long afternoon with Patricia going through the Hargrove and Marsh proposal in detail. It was a well-constructed document. Professionally written, strategically positioned, with a strong emphasis on Derek's own work with nonprofit-adjacent clients. His name appeared 14 times in 42 pages. I counted. I did not feel anger reading it. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect anger, and what I actually felt was something more precise. It was the feeling of a picture coming into focus. The slight blur you have been looking at for months, the thing you kept telling yourself was just the light suddenly resolving into sharp, unmistakable lines. Derek had pursued me at that conference 2.5 years ago. Derek had never asked in 18 months of dating and a 9-month engagement what I did outside of Tremont Capital. Derek had married me the same September. His firm began positioning for the Colebrook contract. I did not know yet whether those 3 facts were connected by design or by coincidence. That distinction mattered to me. I am a precise person. I do not make accusations on the basis of the patterns alone. I needed the thing underneath the pattern. Paul Garrett gave it to me on a Tuesday morning in a manila folder that he slid across the desk without ceremony. Inside, phone records, photographs, dates. A thread of text messages legally obtained through means I did not ask about in detail between Derek and a woman identified as Rachel Voss Senior Consultant Hargrove and Marsh. The thread went back 8 months before our wedding. I closed the folder, set it flat on my desk, put both hands on top of it the way you hold something down when you're not ready to let it move yet. Outside the window, Boston Harbor sat flat and gray under an October sky. I thought about my grandmother, about a 2-bedroom apartment in Providence that smelled like other people's dinners, about 4 acres of land she had held onto for 40 years and left to me like a quiet inheritance of purpose. Stay quiet, stay sharp, let them show you who they are. Derek had shown me. Now it was time to decide what I was going to do about it. Patricia Huang has worked with me since Colebrook was 3 years old and operating out of an office the size of a generous closet. She is 51, originally from Taipei, with a graduate degree in nonprofit administration from Tufts, and the kind of institutional memory that makes her irreplaceable in ways that do not show up on any organizational chart. She knows where every document lives. She remembers every donor conversation, every board vote, every grant decision going back to year 1. She also has what I have always privately considered a gift, the ability to say exactly what needs to be said, in exactly as many words as it requires without one extra syllable of softening or performance. On the Wednesday morning after I received Paul Garrett's folder, I called her into my office at the foundation. Our real office, not my cover at Tremont, but the Colebrook suite on the 14th floor of a building on Atlantic Avenue, with a view of the harbor that I had chosen specifically because my grandmother loved water. I closed the door. I told her to sit down. I told her everything. Not the marriage details, those were mine to carry, and I was not ready to put them down anywhere yet, but everything that was relevant to Colebrook. That I had reviewed the Hargrove and Marsh proposal, that the lead contact on the submission was my husband, that Derek had no knowledge of my role at the foundation, that I had reason to believe his interest in me had not been entirely unconnected to his firm's pursuit of our contract. Patricia listened without moving. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How do you want to handle the conflict of interest disclosure? That was why I trusted her." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I cannot believe he did that. Just what do we do next?" I said, "I want it documented formally before the board review. I want the record to show that I identified the conflict, disclosed it voluntarily, and recused myself from the final vote on the Hargrove submission specifically. The rest of the evaluation process continues as scheduled." She nodded, said she would have the disclosure memo drafted by end of day. Then she said carefully, "in the submission itself." I said, "It stays in the evaluation pool for now. The board will decide on its merits. If the conflict disclosure triggers an automatic disqualification under our bylaws, which I believe it does under Section 7.4, then that determination comes from the board, not from me." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Understood." She picked up her notebook and left. I sat alone in my office for a while after that. The harbor was dark that morning, clouds sitting low over the water, a container ship moving slowly toward the channel. I thought about Section 7.4 of the Colebrook Foundation bylaws, which I had written myself 7 years ago at a kitchen table in a rented apartment in Jamaica Plain, with a cup of cold coffee and a library book on nonprofit governance. Section 7.4 stated in plain language, I had chosen deliberately any vendor or contractor with a direct familial or romantic relationship to a foundation officer must be disclosed at the time of submission. Failure to disclose constitutes automatic disqualification from the current and all subsequent evaluation cycles for a period of not less than 3 years. Derek had not disclosed. He had not disclosed because he did not know. He did not know because he had never asked. That single fact, the not asking, had been sitting at the back of my mind since I returned from Santorini, quiet and persistent, like a sound you cannot place in a dark house. I had spent 2.5 years with this man. I had told him I worked in financial consulting. He had accepted that answer every single time without curiosity, without follow-up, without a single question that might have led him somewhere inconvenient. In the early months of our relationship, I had waited genuinely to see if he would ask. I had even left small openings mentioning a board meeting I needed to prepare for referencing a grant cycle in passing, saying once that I had a donor call that afternoon, without explaining what kind of donor or what they were giving to. He never asked. At the time, I had read that as respect for my privacy, as the uncomplicated quality I had found restful. Now sitting in my Harbor View office with a manila folder in my desk drawer and a conflict disclosure memo being drafted 2 rooms away, I understood it differently. He had not asked because he had already decided what I was. I was Mindy from Tremont Capital. Stable income, no drama, pleasant company. A wife who would not interfere with the career, would not demand too much, would be present at dinners and absent from the parts of his life he wanted to keep separate. He had assessed me and found me useful in a particular limited way, and he had never looked closer because looking closer was not part of what he needed from me. That realization did not break me. I want to be clear about that. It made something settle the way a diagnosis makes something settle, not relief exactly, but the specific relief of knowing the name of a thing that has been wrong for a long time. The folder in my desk drawer told a story that began 8 months before our wedding. Paul Garrett had been thorough. The text thread between Derek and Rachel Voss was extensive, not just logistical, not just the mechanical back and forth of 2 people arranging to be in the same place. There were conversations that were personal, specific, the kind that required a history. In one exchange from the February before our September wedding, Rachel had asked, "Are you sure about this?" Meaning the wedding. Derek had replied, "It makes sense right now. Just give me time. Just give me time." I had read that line 4 times before I put the folder away. I had been the thing that made sense right now. The week after my conversation with Patricia, I began making quiet preparations of a kind that had nothing to do with Colebrook and everything to do with what came next. I called Eleanor Marsh again and told her I was ready to move forward. She began the preliminary paperwork. I went through the apartment systematically, not destructively, not out of anger, but with the methodical attention I gave to any process that needed to be done correctly. I identified what was mine. I documented what was shared. I photographed things that might later become relevant. I made a copy of the joint account statements from the past year, and the deed to a small cabin in Vermont that Derek had purchased 18 months before our wedding, and which he had told me belonged to his college roommate Phil. It did not belong to Phil. That was something else Paul Garrett had found without being asked. I filed that document separately in a folder I labeled simply Vermont. Through all of this, Derek came home every evening and ate dinner and watched television and talked about Grant Hargrove's pressure tactics and the Colebrook contract that his boss needed like oxygen. He said the decision was coming soon. He said whoever was running that foundation clearly had no idea how much Hargrove and Marsh could do for them. He said one night, cutting into a piece of salmon I had cooked, that it was almost frustrating a foundation that size sitting on all that money, and the people in charge apparently could not be reached through normal channels. I said, "That does sound frustrating." He said Hargrove thinks there must be someone on the inside who can make an introduction, some connection nobody has found yet. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip. I said, "I hope he finds it." Derek nodded, already moving on to something else. He did not look at me. He never looked at me the way you look at someone who might surprise you. That was his single greatest mistake, because the board review was now scheduled for 3 weeks out. The venue was confirmed, a private meeting room at the Four Seasons Boston, which the foundation used for its major annual presentations. 40 attendees. Every firm in the evaluation pool had been asked to send their league contacts. Derek's name was on the confirmed attendee list. He just did not know yet what he would find when he walked into that room. Derek came home on a Thursday evening in late October, carrying a bottle of wine and a box of the almond pastries I liked from a bakery on Newbury Street. I noticed immediately. He did not bring things home without a reason. In 2.5 years, the spontaneous gesture had always preceded a conversation. He needed to go a particular way. I accepted the pastries, put them on the counter, poured 2 glasses of the wine, and waited. He sat down at the kitchen island and ran one hand along the edge of the marble countertop the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts. Then he said, "I want to apologize for Santorini." I looked at him. He said I handled things badly. The phone being distracted the whole thing with the police report. He paused. He said the report had been a mistaken judgment, that he had panicked when I was not back by a certain time and had not thought through how it would seem. He said he was sorry. "I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it matters to the story and because I think you deserve the honest version. I felt nothing. Not anger, not the complicated grief of someone who still hopes they are wrong, not the flicker of wanting to believe him that I might have felt a month earlier. Just a flat, clear absence the way a room feels after furniture has been moved out and before anything new has come in. I had done my grieving privately in increments over 4 weeks of documentation and discovery and long mornings at my desk with harbor views and cold coffee. By the time Derek sat across from me with his apology and his Newbury Street pastries, I had already finished mourning the version of him I had thought I married. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." He looked relieved, reached across the counter and covered my hand with his for a moment, said, "I know I've been distracted with work. The Colebrook thing is consuming everything right now." "Hargrove is?" He stopped, shook his head. He said, "It does not matter. What matters is us." I said, "Of course." We drank the wine. We ate 2 of the pastries. We watched something on television that I could not have named 10 minutes later. Derek fell asleep on the couch at 9:30 with his head tipped back and his mouth slightly open, the way people sleep when they have resolved something in their minds and can finally rest. I turned off the television, covered him with the blanket from the arm of the couch, went to bed. 3 days after that, Eleanor Cole came to visit. Derek's mother arrived at 11 in the morning on a Sunday, which was her habit, showing up at times that were technically inconvenient, but which she framed as casual, as if she had simply been in the neighborhood, as if the 40-minute drive from her house in Wellesley was something she did without intention. She was a tall woman, well-dressed in the particular way of women who consider appearance a form of discipline, with silver hair she wore in a low chignon and rings on 3 fingers of her right hand. She had been polite to me since the beginning, in the way that kept maximum distance while remaining technically civil. Derek was out running. I made coffee. She sat at the kitchen island where her son had sat 3 days earlier and looked around the apartment with the evaluating expression she had never quite learned to hide. She said, "You look tired, Mindy." I said, "I slept well, actually." She smiled the smile, the one that stopped before it arrived anywhere. She said, "Marriage is an adjustment, even for the strongest couples." She paused with the timing of someone who had prepared what came next. She said, "Derek carries a great deal right now. His career, the pressure from Grant, all of it. He needs a certain kind of," she searched for the word steadiness at home. I poured her coffee, set the cup down in front of her. She said, "I only mean that he thrives when things are uncomplicated. He always has. His first priority has to be his work right now, and a supportive home makes that possible." She looked at me directly for the first time since she had sat down. She said, "I hope you understand that." I understood it perfectly. I had understood it since the first time she looked at me across a dinner table in Wellesley with the particular expression of a woman doing math. I said, "I think Derek is lucky to have people who care about his success." She studied me for a moment, looking for the edge in that sentence. I gave her nothing to find. She picked up her coffee cup, satisfied with something, and we waited for Derek to come back from his run. After she left, I stood at the kitchen window and thought about the word she had used. Steadiness. As if what I was for Derek was a service, a condition he required, like adequate sleep or a reliable car, functional, necessary, unremarkable. I called Sandra that evening. We met for dinner at a small Italian place in the North End that we had been going to since we were 24, a corner booth with red checkered tablecloths and a breadbasket that arrived without being asked. I told her about Eleanor's visit, about the pastries and the apology, about the Thursday evening and what I had and had not felt. Sandra listened. When I finished, she tore a piece of bread and said, "How much longer?" I said, 2 weeks. She nodded. She said, "And you're sure?" I said, "I have been sure since the morning I wrote it all down in Santorini." She looked at me across the table for a moment with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say the hard thing. Then she said it. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." She said, "Is any part of you staying in this because it is easier than the alternative? Because the foundation, the exposure, the divorce, all of it happening at once is a lot. And I know you, Mindy, and I know you sometimes choose the harder private road because the easier public one feels like surrender." I held the breadbasket for a moment without taking anything. Then I said, "No, I am not staying. I am timing." She accepted that. We ordered pasta. We talked about other things for a while, her sister's new apartment, a documentary we had both been meaning to watch, the first cold snap of the season that had arrived overnight and turned the city sharp and bright. Normal conversation. The kind that holds you in place when everything underneath is moving. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with an email from Patricia. It was brief. It said Grant Hargrove's office called today requesting an expedited timeline on the Colebrook decision. They cited Derek Cole as their primary contact and indicated he had assured them the decision would be favorable. Thought you should know. See you Monday. I read it twice at a red light on Commonwealth Avenue. Derek had told his firm the decision would be favorable. He had made a promise to Grant Hargrove using a foundation. He did not know his wife ran a contract. He did not know his wife controlled a signature he did not know belonged to the woman he came home to every evening with Newbury Street pastries and careful apologies. The light turned green. I put the phone down and drove. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks before the board review at the Four Seasons. 2 weeks before 40 people sat down in a room and the last piece of this fell into place. 2 weeks before Derek Cole walked through a door he had been trying to open for 2 years and found me sitting on the other side of it. I thought about my grandmother, about 4 acres of Providence land, and a name she carried her whole life without anyone thinking to ask what it was worth. I thought about the word steadiness. Then I went home, made tea, and went over the board presentation for the 4th time until it was exactly right. Paul Garrett delivered his second report on a Monday morning. I had asked him after the initial folder to continue monitoring for 2 additional weeks. Not because I needed more evidence. Eleanor Marsh had made clear that what I already had was sufficient for any proceeding I chose to pursue. I asked him to continue because I am a thorough person, and thoroughness had never once cost me more than it saved me. He came to my office at Colebrook at 9 a.m, the same nondescript Somerville manner he carried everywhere, gray jacket, sensible shoes, a folder under his arm that looked identical to every other folder he had ever handed me. He sat down. He said, "There are some developments you should be aware of." I said, "Go ahead." He opened the folder. The first item was a phone log. Derek and Rachel Voss had been in contact an average of 6 times per day over the previous 2 weeks, including 3 calls placed from an unregistered secondary number that Garrett had traced to a prepaid device purchased at a convenience store in Cambridge 7 months ago. 7 months ago was 1 month before our wedding. The second item was a credit card statement. Derek had a card I did not know about, not a joint account, a personal account opened under his name at a bank we did not share. Over the past 3 months, it showed charges at a hotel in the Back Bay, on 4 separate weekday afternoons, a jewelry store on Boylston Street, and a restaurant in the South End on a Tuesday evening when Derek had told me he was working late with his team on the Colebrook pitch materials. I looked at the jewelry store charge for a moment. The date was 3 weeks after our wedding. The third item was a document Garrett placed in front of me carefully as if he understood it was different from the others. It was a screenshot legally obtained of a text exchange between Derek and Rachel from 9 days earlier. The relevant portion read as follows. Rachel had written, "Hargrove keeps asking if you can guarantee the Colebrook signature. What are you telling him?" Derek had written, "I told him I have an inside angle. Just needs a little more time." Rachel had written, "What inside angle? You don't know anyone there." Derek had written, "I know Mindy works adjacent to that world. Financial consulting, nonprofit adjacent clients. If I push the right way, I can probably get a name out of her without her knowing what it's for." Rachel had written, "You've been married 2 months and you're using your wife as a source." Derek had written, "I'm using every resource available. That's how this works. Hargrove lands this contract, I get the promotion, then everything else becomes easier to manage." Rachel had written, "Define easier to manage." Derek had written, "You know what I mean." I read that exchange 3 times. Then I closed the folder and set it on top of the Vermont file in my desk drawer and locked the drawer with the small key I kept on my keychain, alongside my office key and my grandmother's house key, which I had carried for 12 years without ever being able to explain exactly why. Garrett was quiet, watching me with the professional neutrality he wore like a uniform. I said, "Thank you. I'll be in touch if I need anything further." He nodded, picked up his jacket, left without ceremony. I appreciated that about him. I sat at my desk for a long time after he left. I want to be honest about what that text exchange did to me because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would not skip over the parts that hurt. There is a particular quality to the pain of reading something like that, not the sharp, immediate pain of a sudden revelation, but something slower and more invasive, like water, finding every crack in a foundation you thought was solid. He had been thinking of me as a resource, a tool with a name and a keycard and useful adjacencies, someone to extract from without her knowing what it's for. I had cooked dinner for this man 4 nights a week. I had listened to his work frustrations with genuine attention. I had flown to Santorini and sat across from him at a cliffside restaurant and believed for the length of one good evening that I had chosen correctly. I allowed myself 7 minutes of that feeling. I know because I watched the clock on my office wall. When the 7 minutes were up, I opened my laptop and I got to work. The first thing I did was call Eleanor Marsh. I told her I was ready to accelerate the timeline. She said she would have the initial filing prepared within the week. I said also, "I need you to review the bylaws provision around undisclosed conflicts of interest and prepare a formal opinion letter for the board. She said she understood. We hung up. The second thing I did was call Patricia and ask her to move the board review date up by 4 days. She asked if there was a logistical reason. I said I want it done before the end of the month. She checked with the Four Seasons, confirmed the room was available, and sent updated notices to all 40 attendees by noon. Derek received his updated confirmation that afternoon. He forwarded it to Grant Hargrove within 23 minutes, which I know because Patricia's assistant, who handled incoming vendor correspondence, flagged it in our system. Hargrove replied to Derek, "Excellent, we'll be ready. Make sure you work that inside angle before the meeting. We need every advantage." Derek replied, "Working on it tonight." That evening he came home and poured himself a glass of scotch, something he did when he was preparing for a performance, and sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked, with the careful casualness of a man who had been rehearsing the question, whether I had ever come across anyone connected to the Colebrook Foundation through my work at Tremont. I looked up from the report I was reviewing. I said, "The name is familiar." "Why?" He said, "Hargrove and Marsh has a proposal in with them. Big contract. Grant has been pursuing it for 2 years. Derek swirled his scotch. He said, "I figured since you work in adjacent circles, you might have crossed paths with someone on the inside. Even a name would help." I set my report down. I looked at my husband at the careful arrangement of his expression, the practiced lightness of his tone, the way he was watching me with the exact attention he had never given me when I actually needed it. I said, "I'll ask around." His face opened with relief. He said that would mean a lot. "Seriously, Mindy, this is important." I said, "I know how important it is." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Said, "I don't tell you enough how much I appreciate you." I turned my hand over and squeezed back. That night after Derek fell asleep, I went to my desk in the spare room, the room he had never asked to see, the one I kept locked when I worked late, and which he had always accepted as simply my space, and I opened my laptop and I finalized the presentation I would be delivering in 11 days to 40 people in a Four Seasons meeting room. I adjusted 3 slides, tightened 2 sections of the financial summary, added 1 line to the opening remarks that I had been considering for a week, and finally decided to keep. The line read, "The Colebrook Foundation was built on a single conviction that the people closest to you are not always the ones who see you most clearly." I read it back once. Then I saved the file, closed the laptop, and went to bed. 11 days. Derek slept soundly beside me, unaware that the inside angle he had been working all evening was lying 6 inches to his left, breathing quietly in the dark with everything already in place. Grant Hargrove hosted his dinner on a Wednesday evening 8 days before the board review. It was held at Meridian, a private dining room inside a members-only club on Beacon Hill that required a reservation 6 weeks in advance and a membership that cost more annually than most people's car payments. The invitation had come to Derek 3 days earlier, a formal card cream stock engraved lettering requesting the presence of senior staff and their spouses for what Hargrove described as a team appreciation evening. I had seen the card on the kitchen counter. Derek had mentioned it in passing, said it was mandatory in the way that partner-level dinners always were, and asked if I would come. I said of course. I wore a navy dress I had owned for 2 years, simple cut, no ornamentation, the kind of thing that reads as quietly expensive without announcing itself. I did my own hair. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings, which I had carried in a small velvet pouch in my desk drawer since she died, and which I put on only when something mattered. Derek noticed them when I came out of the bedroom. He said, "You look nice." Then his phone buzzed and he looked down at it, and that was the end of that. The car service took us across the river and up Beacon Hill in 20 minutes. The club's entrance was a narrow townhouse facade with a brass plate and no signage, the kind of place that assumed you already knew where you were going. Inside, dark wood paneling, oil portraits, the muffled acoustics of thick carpets and heavy curtains. A member of staff took our coats. Someone handed me a glass of champagne. Derek immediately located Grant Hargrove across the room and moved toward him with the slightly accelerated walk of a man reporting for duty. I stayed where I was. There were perhaps 30 people in the pre-dinner reception, senior staff from Hargrove and Marsh, and their partners, a few faces I recognized from Derek's descriptions. Rachel Voss was not present, which I noted without surprise. This was a spousal event. She would have had the judgment to stay away. I moved through the room slowly, accepted a second glass of champagne I did not drink, listened to 2 conversations without joining them, watched Derek across the room with Grant Hargrove, the body language of those 2 men, the way Derek leaned slightly forward when Hargrove spoke, the way Hargrove used his hands when he wanted something understood. At dinner, I was seated beside a senior partner named Thomas Weld, who spent 20 minutes explaining the challenges of scaling a boutique consultancy before asking as an afterthought what I did. I said financial consulting. He nodded with the mild interest people show when an answer confirmed something they already assumed and turned back to the man on his other side. Across the table, Derek caught my eye and gave me a small nod. The nod of a man whose wife is performing adequately at a function that matters to him. I lifted my champagne glass slightly in return. After the main course, Grant Hargrove stood at the head of the table. He was a broad man in his late 50s with the authoritative bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his opinion set the agenda. He thanked the staff for their work. He talked about the firm's trajectory, its ambitions the year ahead. He was a competent speaker, controlled, confident, the kind of man who understood that pauses did more work than words. Then he set his glass down and his tone shifted. He said, "I want to speak plainly for a moment because the people in this room have earned that." He said the Colebrook Foundation contract represented the single most significant opportunity in the firm's 22-year history. He said the decision was 11 days away. He said he believed they had submitted the strongest possible proposal, but that in his experience the strongest proposal did not always win on paper alone. He looked around the table. His eyes moved from face to face with the deliberate patience of a man making a point. He said relationships close contracts. Information opens doors. If anyone in this room, anyone at all, has a connection to the Colebrook organization that has not yet been explored, now is the moment to name it. The firm will remember who helped make this happen. Silence for a beat. Derek spoke. He said, "I've been working an angle." He said it with the confidence of a man cashing in something he had been saving. He said, "I have reason to believe I can get a name before the review. Someone close enough to the decision-making to matter." Hargrove looked at him, said, "How close?" Derek said, "Very close. Within the week." Hargrove held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once the precise nod of a man filing something away for future accounting. He raised his glass. He said to the people in this room who know how to find what the firm needs. Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine. I looked at the champagne pale gold small bubbles rising and breaking at the surface in the unhurried way of things that do not know they are being watched. Then I looked at Derek, who was smiling at Grant Hargrove with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who believed he had just secured his future. He had not looked at me once during that exchange. I thought that is the last dinner. After dessert, while coats were being retrieved and conversations wound down, Hargrove moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of a man maximizing a social occasion. He reached me near the door and introduced himself with the warm, assessing handshake of someone who had spent a career deciding quickly whether a person was useful. He said, "Derek speaks highly of you. Finance background." I said, "That's right." He said, "Good people to know in this city." He smiled, said, "I hope we see more of you." I said, "I imagine you will." He moved on. I found Derek's coat on the rack and handed it to him. In the car on the way home, he was buoyant, talking about Hargrove's remarks, the room's energy, the contract. He said, "I think this is really going to happen." He said, "I have one more move to make and then it's done." I looked out the window at the Charles River dark and reflecting the bridge lights in long broken lines. I said, "I think you're right. I think it's almost done." He put his hand over mine on the seat between us. Satisfied. Certain. I turned my hand over and let him hold it for the rest of the ride home. 7 days. That night, I sent 2 emails. The first was to Patricia confirming the final attendee list and asking her to ensure that the Foundation's legal counsel would be physically present in the room for the board review, seated at the table visible from the entrance. The second was to Eleanor Marsh. It said, "Please have the filing ready to execute on Friday of next week, the day after the board review." She replied, "At 11:47, everything will be ready. You have everything you need." I read her reply and thought, yes. I thought about a 26-year-old woman sitting at a kitchen table in Jamaica Plain with a cold cup of coffee and a library book on nonprofit governance, writing bylaws for an organization that did not yet exist, choosing every word with the particular care of someone who understands that the sentences you write in the beginning are the ones that protect you in the end. I had written Section 7.47 years ago. I had written it for situations exactly like this one. Not because I had known this moment was coming, but because my grandmother had taught me that the world would always show you who it was eventually, and the only question was whether you had built something solid enough to still be standing when it did. I closed my laptop, put my grandmother's pearl earrings back in their velvet pouch, set them on the corner of my desk where I would see them in the morning. 7 days. The morning of the board review, I woke at 5:15 without an alarm. I lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to Derek breathe beside me, the slow, even rhythm of a man who had slept well, who had no reason not to. He had come home the night before in a good mood, had made a point of being attentive at dinner, had said twice that he felt good about things. He did not specify which things. I did not ask. I got up quietly, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window while the city came forward out of the dark, the harbor lights first, then the shapes of buildings, then the particular gray-pink of a November Boston dawn that always reminded me of the inside of a shell. I drank my coffee slowly. I did not review my notes. I did not rehearse. I had prepared for 3 weeks, and everything I needed was already in place. The only thing left was to walk into the room. I showered and dressed. Navy blazer over a white shirt, the same combination I wore when I chaired board meetings, the one Patricia had once told me looked like someone who had already decided. I put on my grandmother's pearl earrings. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm that I was ready. Then I turned off the light and picked up my bag. Derek was awake by then, moving through the kitchen in his suit, checking his phone, running through the morning the way he always did, efficient, forward-facing, already somewhere else in his head. He looked up when I passed through, said, "You look good." "Big day," I said. "Board meeting. Should run most of the day." He said same. "The Colebrook Review is this morning." He straightened his tie in the reflection of the dark kitchen window. He said, "I have a feeling today is the day everything changes." I said, "I think you're right." He kissed me on the cheek the way people kiss someone they have stopped seeing. I picked up my bag and left. The Four Seasons on Boylston Street had given us the Clarendon Room, a long rectangular space on the second floor with tall windows overlooking the public garden, a central conference table that seated 20 in additional seating arranged along the perimeter walls for the broader attendee group. Patricia had overseen the setup personally. When I arrived at 8:15, everything was in order, materials at each seat, water and coffee service along the credenza, the foundation's logo on the presentation screen at the front of the room. Eleanor Marsh was already there, seated to the right of the chair I would occupy in the precise position I had requested. She had a leather portfolio in front of her and the composed expression of a woman who had sat in difficult rooms her entire career and found them entirely manageable. She looked up when I came in, gave me a single nod, and went back to her notes. Patricia met me at the door with a final attendee confirmation. 39 of 40 confirmed. She said the one absence was a representative from a smaller firm whose principal had a family emergency. Everyone else was coming. She said it quietly, and then even more quietly, Hargrove and Marsh confirmed their full delegation 20 minutes ago. Derek Cole is listed as lead presenter. I said good. Then I went to my chair and sat down. The room filled between 8:30 and 9. Foundation board members took the central table seats. Vendor representatives and their teams arranged themselves in the perimeter chairs by firm, the way delegations position themselves at negotiations, clustered facing inward, watching the table with the particular alertness of people who have prepared for a specific outcome and are now waiting to receive it. I sat at the head of the table with my back to the windows and the public garden light coming in behind me. I opened my portfolio. I reviewed nothing. I watched the door. At 8:52, the Hargrove and Marsh delegation came in. Grant Hargrove entered first, the instinct of a man who always preceded his team, who understood that arrival was its own form of statement. He was in a dark suit, composed, already scanning the room with the practiced assessment of someone calculating where the power sat. 2 senior partners followed him, a junior associate, and then Derek carrying a presentation folder and the expression of a man who was containing his confidence with some effort, the way you contain something that wants to be larger than the occasion calls for. He found a seat along the perimeter wall, third chair from the left facing the table. He had not yet looked at the head of the table. Patricia called the room to order at 9 o'clock precisely. She welcomed attendees, outlined the agenda, and explained that the Foundation's CEO would be chairing the session and would begin with opening remarks before the evaluation presentations commenced. She said, "Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of the Colebrook Foundation, Ms. Mindy Cole." I stood up. The room was already quiet in the way rooms are when a formal proceeding begins. Then it became a different kind of quiet, the kind that has texture that you can feel against your skin. I heard it shift in the moment between Patricia saying my name and the first person registering what they had heard. I looked at the room. Grant Hargrove's face did not move for 2 full seconds. Then something happened behind his eyes, not a single expression, but a rapid sequence like pages turning recognition, calculation to realization, and then a stillness that was not calm, but its closest imitation. Derek looked up from his folder. I watched his face go through it. The confusion, first a fraction of a second where the name and the face and the chair at the head of the table had not yet assembled themselves into a single fact. Then they did. His mouth opened slightly, his folder tilted in his hands. The junior associate beside him noticed and looked over, and Derek straightened without appearing to notice he had moved. I held his gaze for exactly one beat, not long enough to be cruel, long enough to be clear. Then I looked at the room and I began. I said good morning. The Colebrook Foundation was established 11 years ago with a single conviction that the people closest to you are not always the ones who see you most clearly. That conviction has guided every decision this foundation has made, including the ones we are here to discuss today. I spoke for 12 minutes. I covered the foundation's history, its current asset base of $2.4 billion, its strategic priorities for the coming 5 years, and the criteria by which the board had evaluated the proposals under consideration. I spoke without notes. My voice was even and clear, and I did not rush a single sentence. When I finished the opening remarks, I nodded to Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor stood. She said, "Before we proceed to presentations, the board has a procedural matter to address." She opened her portfolio. She said, "Pursuant to Section 7.4 of the Colebrook Foundation bylaws, the board has identified an undisclosed conflict of interest in one submission." The submission in question was filed by Hargrove and Marsh. The conflict arises from the fact that the firm's designated representative, Mr. Derek Cole, holds a direct familial relationship with the foundation's chief executive officer, a relationship that was not disclosed at the time of submission as required by foundation bylaws. She set the document down on the table. She said under Section 7.4, failure to disclose a qualifying relationship constitutes automatic disqualification from the current evaluation cycle and all subsequent cycles for a period of not less than 3 years. The board has reviewed this determination and finds it consistent with the bylaws as written. The Hargrove and Marsh submission is accordingly withdrawn from consideration effective this morning. The room was completely still. I did not look at Derek. I did not look at Grant Hargrove. I looked at the window, at the public garden below, the last of the November leaves on the trees, the light falling clean and direct the way it does on cold, clear mornings when the air has been rinsed of everything unnecessary. Eleanor sat down. I said, "We will now proceed to the remaining presentations." I turned to the first firm on the agenda and said their name, and the session continued. I want to tell you about the moment I chose not to look at Derek's face. I had thought about that moment many times in the weeks before it arrived. I had imagined it with the particular precision I gave to things I needed to be ready for. I had wondered whether I would feel satisfaction or grief, or the complicated mixture of both that most significant endings carry. I had wondered whether I would want him to see me looking. I decided somewhere in those 3 weeks of preparation that I did not need to watch him understand. That was for him. What happened in my chest, the slow settling of something that had been wrong for a long time, that was mine. I kept my eyes on the public garden, and I let the room do what it was going to do. The presentations ran until 12:45. 3 firms. 3 sets of prepared materials, polished delivery, practiced answers to the board's questions. I chaired each one with the same attention I gave to everything present-focused. Taking notes in the leather portfolio Patricia had placed at my seat that morning. The work was real, and it deserved real consideration, regardless of what else was happening in the room. That was something my grandmother had understood about integrity, that it was not a condition you applied selectively only when it was convenient or when someone was watching. It was the thing you did, especially when neither of those was true. The Hargrove and Marsh delegation remained in the room. That had not been required. Eleanor had been clear they were welcome to leave after the disqualification announcement, and no one would have thought less of the decision. But Grant Hargrove stayed. He sat in his perimeter chair with the stillness of a man who had decided that leaving would cost more than remaining, that the appearance of composure was the last asset available to him, and he was not yet ready to spend it. His 2 senior partners stayed as well, following his lead, the way people follow a captain who has not yet acknowledged that the ship is going down. Derek stayed. He sat in his chair for all 3 presentations with his folder closed in his lap and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the table and the window. He did not move much. Once during the second presentation, I saw him take a slow breath, the kind you take when you're managing something physical when the body is responding to information the mind has not finished processing. The junior associate beside him had given up any pretense of note-taking around 10:15 and was simply sitting waiting for the thing to be over. At 12:45, I thanked the presenting firms and called a brief recess before the board's deliberation session. The room began to move chairs, pushing back quiet conversations, starting people reaching for phones. Grant Hargrove crossed the room toward me before I had stood fully from my chair. He came around the end of the table and positioned himself with the directness of a man unaccustomed to waiting for access. He said, "Ms. Cole." He said my name with the careful enunciation of someone recalibrating in real time assigning new weight to syllables that had meant nothing to him 2 hours earlier. He said I would appreciate a moment of your time, privately. I picked up my portfolio from the table. I said I have 15 minutes before deliberations begin. He took that as agreement and followed me to the small anteroom adjacent to the Clarendon room, a narrow space with 2 chairs and a side table, and the muffled quiet of a room designed for exactly these kinds of conversations. I left the door open. Eleanor positioned herself in the hallway just outside it, which was not accidental. Hargrove sat down. He was still composed, I gave him that. Whatever he was feeling had not broken the surface. He said, I want to be straightforward with you. This morning was a significant surprise. He paused. He said, I was not aware of your relationship to Derek. I want you to know that. I said, I understand. He said the proposal we submitted was the result of 8 months of work by a dedicated team. The disqualification, while I understand the procedural basis, represents a substantial loss for the firm. He looked at me with the direct measuring gaze of a man making one final assessment of available options. He said, I'm wondering whether there is a path forward. A separate conversation about the Foundation's consulting needs outside the current evaluation cycle. Purely exploratory. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, Mr. Hargrove, the bylaws that disqualified your firm this morning were written to protect the Foundation's integrity. They apply uniformly. There is no separate path. I said it without heat, without satisfaction, with the same measured tone I would have used to explain any procedural matter. Then I said, I appreciate your directness. I hope you extend the same to your team when you speak with them about this morning. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then he stood. He said, I see. He said it the way men say things when they have run out of moves and need a sentence to exit with. He thanked me for my time. He walked back into the corridor and toward the main room without looking at Eleanor as he passed. I stayed in the anteroom for a moment. Outside the window, a single pigeon landed on the ledge, looked in, and flew away. I almost smiled. Derek was waiting in the corridor when I came out. He was standing with his back against the wall, hands at his sides. His folder gone left somewhere in the main room, I supposed, or set down because holding it no longer made sense. He looked like a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and discarded all of them in the past 2 hours. He said, Mindy. Just my name. Nothing after it for a moment. I stopped. I waited. He said, how long? I said, how long have I run the Foundation, or how long have I known about Rachel? His jaw moved. He said both. I said I founded Colebrook 11 years ago. I have known about Rachel since the week I came home from Santorini. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the calculation was gone. Whatever architecture he had built around this situation had come down, and what was underneath was something rawer and less managed. He said, I didn't know. About the Foundation, I want you to believe that. I said, I do believe it. He said then, I didn't marry you because of... I said, I know you didn't marry me for the Foundation. I said it clearly and without cruelty because it was true, and he deserved the accurate version. Then I said, but that doesn't change what you did marry me for. Or what you decided I was. He looked at the floor. A long moment passed. Down the corridor, someone laughed at something bright and ordinary, entirely disconnected from the hallway where we were standing. He said, I'm sorry. I looked at my husband, at the man who had brought pastries home 3 weeks ago and held my hand in the car on the way back from Beacon Hill and slept soundly beside me while I finalized the presentation that would end the life he had been quietly constructing at my expense. I said, I know you are. Then I said, Eleanor Marsh will be in contact with your attorney by end of week. I would encourage you to respond promptly. It will make everything easier for both of us. I walked back into the Clarendon room. The board deliberated for 90 minutes. I recused myself from the room during the discussion, as I had disclosed in writing 3 days earlier, and waited in the anteroom with a cup of coffee that went cold and a view of the public garden that I found in that particular hour genuinely consoling. Patricia came to get me at 2:45. She said the board had reached a decision. The contract went to a firm called Aldridge Partners, a woman-led consultancy out of Cambridge that had submitted a proposal I had found genuinely impressive when I reviewed it 6 weeks earlier. The lead partner had spent 15 years in education nonprofit work before pivoting to consulting, and it showed in every page of her materials. The board vote was unanimous. I signed the engagement letter at 3:15. In the elevator afterward, Patricia stood beside me and did not say anything until the doors opened on the lobby. Then she said, You handled that beautifully. I said the Foundation handled it. The bylaws handled it. I just chaired the meeting. She looked at me sideways, said, "Don't do that." I almost smiled again. This time I let it happen. Outside, Boston was doing what Boston does in November, cold and bright and entirely indifferent to personal drama, the wind off the harbor cutting through whatever you were wearing and reminding you efficiently that the world was larger than your particular morning. I stood on the Boylston Street sidewalk for a moment before getting into the car Patricia had arranged. I thought about Grant Hargrove in that anteroom, about the look on his face when he understood there was no separate path. My phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. Well, I typed back done. She replied with a single word, "Good." I got into the car. The driver pulled into traffic and headed toward the south end. I watched the city go by the brownstones, the bare trees, the people moving with the purposeful hurry of a November afternoon, and I thought about Derek standing in that corridor with his folder gone and the calculation finally out of his face. I thought about Eleanor Cole and her word, steadiness. I thought about what it meant to be steady, not the steadiness of someone who absorbs whatever is done to them and asks for nothing. The other kind. The kind my grandmother had. The kind that builds something real in a closet-sized office and names it after a woman no one else thought to remember, and then waits quietly and precisely for the world to show itself. It had shown itself. Now I had work to do. The divorce was filed on a Friday. Eleanor Marsh submitted the paperwork at 9 in the morning, 4 days after the board review while Derek was at the office. I know the timing because I had chosen it deliberately not to avoid confrontation, but because I had learned over the course of that autumn that clean endings required clean logistics and clean logistics required that the variables be controlled wherever possible. Derek's attorney received the filing notice at 9:47. Derek called me at 10:03. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 4 minutes long, and I listened to it once sitting at my desk at Colebrook with the harbor outside the window, and then I forwarded it to Eleanor without responding. That was the last direct communication between us for 6 weeks. The proceedings moved faster than most. Derek did not contest the primary terms. I think the speed of it surprised people who knew us colleagues, acquaintances, the peripheral figures who inhabit a shared social life and discover its edges only when it ends. Sandra told me later that someone had asked her with genuine puzzlement how 2 people could unwind a marriage in 4 months. She had said when the foundation was never solid, there's not much to unwind. I thought that was exactly right. What took slightly longer was the Vermont matter. The cabin Derek had purchased 18 months before our wedding, the one he had told me belonged to Phil, which it did not turn out to be registered under a holding company that required 3 weeks of legal work to fully document. I will not go into the details here except to say that Eleanor handled it with her customary efficiency and that the outcome was consistent with what the documentation supported. Derek's attorney did not push back significantly. I think by that point, pushing back had stopped seeming like a viable strategy. Rachel Voss left Hargrove and Marsh in January. She took a position at a smaller firm in Philadelphia. I know this because Patricia mentioned it in passing one morning, not as news but as the kind of peripheral fact that surfaces when professional circles are small enough. I did not ask for more information. What happened between Derek and Rachel after the 4 seasons was not a story I needed to follow. Grant Hargrove resigned as CEO of Hargrove and Marsh in April. The official statement cited a desire to pursue other interests, which is what official statements always say. The less official version, which reached me through the natural circulation of information in a city where everyone eventually knows everyone, was that the firm had lost 3 significant clients in the months following the Colebrook disqualification. Clients who had heard the story assessed what it said about the firm's judgment and made their decisions accordingly. The firm restructured. 2 of the senior partners I had seen at the Meridian dinner departed within 6 months. The junior associate, who I later learned had privately raised concerns about the submission before it was filed and been overruled, was promoted. I found that last part satisfying in a way that felt clean and appropriate. Derek left Boston in the spring. He took a position in Chicago, a lateral move to a mid-sized consultancy that I knew by reputation as competent but unremarkable. Eleanor Cole called me once in February from a number I did not recognize. I answered because I did not know who it was. She said my name, and there was a pause, and then she said, "I owe you something." I said, "You do not owe me anything, Eleanor." She said, "I treated you as less than you were." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am sorry for that." There was another pause, and then she said goodbye and hung up, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand for a moment, thinking about the particular courage it takes for certain kinds of people to make certain kinds of calls, and I gave her the credit she was due. I did not call back, but I gave her the credit. 8 months after the day I stood in that corridor outside the Clarendon room, I sat on the terrace of my penthouse in the South End, on a Saturday morning in late June, with a cup of coffee and no particular plans until noon. The harbor was flat and pale in the early light. A container ship was moving slowly toward the channel, the same slow progress I had watched from this window through an entire autumn and winter and spring, while everything underneath my life rearranged itself into something true. Colebrook had closed its largest grant cycle in the Foundation's history that spring, $42 million distributed across 68 programs in 11 states. The Aldridge Partners engagement was going well. Patricia had been promoted to COO, a title she had earned 6 years earlier, and which I had been too cautious to formalize until I stopped mistaking caution for prudence. We were in the early stages of planning a scholarship endowment in my grandmother's name, Doris Colebrook, that would fund first-generation college students in Providence, Rhode Island, beginning the following academic year. I had thought about what to name it for a long time. Eventually, I decided on something simple: the Doris Colebrook Award for Young Women Who Stay Sharp. Patricia had looked at the draft proposal and said, "Are we allowed to name it that I said I run the foundation?" Patricia had laughed, a real one, the kind she rarely produced in professional settings, and that had settled it. Sandra came over that Saturday morning, and we sat on the terrace with coffee and the newspaper and talked about her sister's wedding plans and a book we had both read, and the particular pleasure of a June morning in Boston, when the city has finally remembered how to be warm. We did not talk about Derek or Hargrove or Santorini. Those things had happened and they were part of the story, and I would not pretend otherwise. But they were not what that morning was for. At some point, Sandra looked over and said, "You seem different." I said, "Different how?" She thought about it. She said, "Settled. Like something stopped pulling at you." I looked out at the harbor, at the ship that had almost cleared the channel, now moving toward open water, carrying whatever it was, carrying toward wherever it was going. I said, "Something did. I want to tell you before I finish what I actually learned. Not the lesson you might expect, not something about trusting people less or keeping your walls up or protecting yourself from the world. I learned something more specific than that, and I think more useful. I learned that the people who do not ask questions have already decided the answers. The man who never asked what I did outside of Tremont Capital had already decided what I was worth knowing. And that decision, made early, held quietly, never examined, was the thing that cost him everything. Do not be with someone who has already decided your dimensions. Do not let anyone's certainty about your limits become the ceiling of your own life. My grandmother stayed quiet and stayed sharp and let the world show itself, and then she held 4 acres of Providence land for 40 years without telling a single person what she was planning to do with it, and when she left it to me, she left me everything she knew about patience and precision and the particular dignity of a woman who does not explain herself to people who have not earned the explanation. I built a $2.4 billion foundation on that inheritance, and I would do it all again. Every closet-sized office, every cold cup of coffee, every carefully written bylaw, every morning, I spent documenting the truth instead of arguing with the lie. Stay quiet, stay sharp. Let them show you who they are, and when they do, be ready. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt familiar in your own life, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you took from it. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about the moment you finally stopped explaining yourself to someone who had already decided not to see you. And if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. There are more stories like this one. Women who stayed quiet longer than anyone should have to. Women who built things in silence. Women who walked into rooms that were not expecting them. They deserve to be heard. I will see you in the next one.